All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Paulogia Live and MythVision podcast. How's it going, Paul?
It is going well. My afternoon is better knowing that I was going to be hanging out with you. So we're good.
Well, I'm thankful for your time. You are an artist with your work. And so I tell people all the time that I know when I wake up in the morning and I'm cooking breakfast almost every morning, I have like a ritual. Literally,
Okay.
we're still religious, if you will, by the patterns of behaviors. And I cook my 2 eggs, I get a couple pieces of bacon, and I find out there's a Paulogia video dropped. I'm like, my morning is better. Much better.
I appreciate that's a lot of pressure, Derek. I don't know.
So you have to start producing more every day. No, I'm kidding.
No. That's right.
Before we begin, you have for a long time, for those who are just now tuning into MythVision, and of course might be just tuning into you, some people might be new. There's always people just now discovering us.
Absolutely.
You were an ex-Christian. You have been studying Christianity and its implications of the resurrection for a long time.
Indeed.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I grew up Mennonite kid, which, if you're not familiar with that particular denomination / sect / cult / ethnicity, that Mennonites are, in terms of religion, obviously as conservative as you get, and evangelical. Grew up in that, so I was a young Earth creationist. I, up until recently, thought that dinosaurs were on the ark. That was, of course, they were. All those kind of things. About 10 years ago now, these years are starting to creep by, Derek. I don't know. About 10 years ago was when I started to have my crisis of young Earth creationism may not be true, and there was a whole ordeal with that. And then I had once I decided that, yeah, young Earth creationism is false. That doesn't, of course, really speak to Christianity in any kind of sophisticated way necessarily. But for me, it set on this slice. Well, if I'd been lied to all my life about this, about the science parts, what else was I lied to? So I'm like, well, let me try and build back my Christianity based on, without assuming any of it was true to begin with, right? Like without coming in saying that the Gospels are correct or that they're even better than an average historical document. Not worse than, but not better than either. And then I kind of I didn't start with resurrection, but someone challenged me that really, with resurrection being the linchpin, if you can't really explain the start of Christianity without a resurrection, then you probably should stick with Christianity. And so then it was like, well, can we explain the start of Christianity without a resurrection? And I think the answer is a resounding, well, of course we can, if we don't assume to start with that the Gospels are gospel truth, as it were. That phrase is hilarious to me now. But
if I may pick your psychology here, because
yeah.
I am the king, guilty among every apologist on planet Earth of psychologizing, psychoanalyzing. That's because I know what the hell it's like to be a believer and how your brain and the kind of maneuvers you might do. So what I find ironic about the young Earth creationism, Noah's Ark, dinosaurs, this was, in your experience, it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, this was a existential issue in your understanding of Scripture, to a point where the shock of what if I'm wrong is, for some people, it might be the cross. And don't get me wrong, that's a big one. But like this makes the whole inerrancy, or what my belief in the Word of God is, kind of on shaky ground, allowing you to doubt, have I been lied to?
Yeah.
And then people always go, oh, you don't believe in God, right? Which I know a lot of people get thrown off by that, and they immediately kind of assume the worst in someone like you and me. But they go, well, why didn't you try the thousands of other gods before you leap to that conclusion? Again, once you've like dedicated and put everything into one sole ultimate being, you then go, hold on. I'm not going to just leap to another. There's a being there. Like I need to have this be the being or that being the being necessarily. You might start questioning the whole paradigm because, again, like the quote I was reading to you before we went live, like is this idea like children, right? You tell them, how do babies come? Oh, well, the stork, sweetheart, the stork brings the children. Then the child finds out that it's not a stork that brings the babies. And then they've been deceived. And now their whole world shatters. Do we expect them to find other mythical routes in which explains the stork? Or do we go, biologically, there's this thing called sex, and let's explain how this, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
anyway, sorry for rambling.
No, I love it. That's a very good analogy. The kind of evangelical I was, interestingly, we got so prepared. So what I didn't include there, I yada over. Like, I went to Bible college. I was in youth and music ministry for decades. I memorized most of the New Testament. I taught other students to memorize most of the New Testament, like all in, right? But when you're all in those flavors, one thing they really do effectively is they actually teach you what's wrong with Mormonism, what's wrong with Islam, what's wrong with, just the denominations we don't like, what's wrong with Seventh-day Adventism, what's wrong with Catholics. Like, we actually, weirdly, I was trained all those decades to pre-reject all those. So I didn't come out of Christianity stumbling like, oh, well, maybe some of these others are correct, because I'd already looked into them in their own way, or I knew at least what the Achilles heels were. So, yeah.
Okay. This brings us to, I mean, I kind of needed a little bit of like a prequel before we get into the Star Wars trilogy here of Jesus. Wow. You and I have done quite a bit over the last few years. What I feel you've done differently than what I've done is you've really honed in on the science, if you will, a scientific approach of trying to naturally explain how we can explain the origin of resurrection, its belief, and how it's spread. You and Shannon are like big into the whole psychology and science of the mind and brain and how that plays out in other social settings. So, using a big word, heuristically, if we looked at how other human movements with superstitious beliefs, how they behaved and how these ideas might have spread, and then apply that in like analogous to Christianity, you then can actually see how things play out. And You're doing it like a detective, like a really good detective. So take us wherever you want. I'm here to just correspond and dialogue back and forth, but really learn your strongest stillman case for why Jesus didn't rise from the dead and your best explanation.
Well, I think the most important thing that I'm learning now, I'm not learning, it's about 4 years ago when I first put out my first video on what I call my minimal witnesses hypothesis. I didn't even call it that back then. But what I've been doing is I keep refining it and keep putting out videos, because what's happened is I've had people like Dale Allison and Bart Ehrman and Mike Licona and Gary Habermas and the list goes on of people responding to my videos, and I'm actually been able to say, oh, that's great. They're poking and prodding, like, to get me to refine this more and more. And the one thing I'm realizing of late is that we're talking past each other, because they are looking for, an apologist is typically looking for, what's your naturalistic explanation for the resurrection? Whereas what you and I are talking about is, what's the naturalistic explanation for the existence of Christianity? And those are super important distinctions that I'm learning more and more. If we don't make that distinction up front, we're going to completely talk past each other. Because when you say, I'm looking for a naturalistic hypothesis for the resurrection, you're saying, I'm assuming that everything in the Bible happened exactly. Jesus had breakfast with them. Thomas poked his finger in the side. How do you explain that naturally? Right? But that's what they're doing. And so Inspiring Philosophy this last week had a PhD psychologist researcher on his channel, and they were trying to poke holes at my hypothesis, and they were both admitted up front, we are both maximalists. They call themselves. We are maximalists. We come into this assuming that the Gospels are 100% correct. And so how does your hypothesis compare? And I'm like, well, it does terribly. It does, because I'm not attempting to explain how Thomas could have poked his finger in someone's side and been wrong about that.
Right.
You and I are both trying to say, look, what the evidence we actually have is that Christianity exists, not that the Gospels are correct, right? So
Right.
how can we explain how these books might have been written and the way they were written if in fact they are not recording history? And you've had more scholars than probably you can count and I can count on your channel who have weighed in on the construction of the Gospels, the construction of the Old Testament, and Hebrew Bible. I'm trying to change my phrasing on calling it Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible is the better way to say it.
Yeah. It's
Anyway,
the polite way. And yeah, but
right. Yeah. Well, someone was joking with me, my next project should be, just add an extra book onto someone else's religion. And that's how you really get successful is you steal someone else's. So, go add something onto the Book of Mormon and make that a thing. But,
well,
anyway,
if I may just poke in here, because
do it.
So this is a fascinating way to approach this, and it what you do when you say this is very respectful to the apologist, to be frank, because you're at least going, look, guys, let's at least have common ground on how we're actually recognizing this. You're accepting this literature at face value for what it's saying. To mostly, I mean, I'm not going to say every single thing. Like if you get Mike Lacona in a room, I go, okay,
Right.
yeah, Matthew, that whole zombie apocalypse, I know that's more metaphor or something. I don't think that literally happened, right? But for the most part, they'll try to say this stuff is reportage, eyewitness testimony, and you know how they do that. Where you and I would go, sorry, we don't buy that. We think legend, we think fiction, we think myth, even maybe whole cloth. Some sections may be invented whole cloth. Some sections might have a kernel of something behind it, but there's no way to know what actually occurred. These kinds of things. So we're approaching the literary works completely different. I still like the way you worded that when you said, how do we naturalistically explain Thomas poking in the holes of Jesus, right? I want to still use that language and go, okay, hear me out, apologist. Naturalistically, since I'm dealing with the world in which we see and observe and experience on a day-to-day basis, I would say in a naturalistic world, there's fictive literature, right?
Right.
Well, how do you explain this narrative? We have to approach these as texts to begin with. So if it's really going to fundamentally approach like how we actually are just viewing this material. And the unfortunate part for you and me in our predicament is all we have is fan fiction. We only have the works from fans. Imagine if we had a Lucian or a Celsus, a first century one, or Heraclitus, who's condemning the ancient Orphic and Dionysian cults of the 5th century BCE when they were washing themselves in the blood of the animal, which was symbolic of Dionysus, for remission of sins. And he says, you're just washing yourself practically with mud, trying to say that you're clean. And he mocked all the poets, and he said that Homer needed to be whipped and Hesiod was full of it. And anyway, he was a philosopher, very skeptical. Imagine if we had the pen like that telling us about Jesus or Paul. We don't,
Exactly.
not of the time period, right?
Or even, yeah, and as you say, or even as someone who knew them but disagreed. We don't even have that, right? So that's too bad. But
it is.
Yeah. So that is I kind of am now opening with this notion that if you are wanting to evaluate what I do or what Derek does largely, and if you're coming at it saying, well, this doesn't explain the Bible being true but naturalistic, you're just wasting your time. Sorry, there's just by definition a naturalistic hypothesis has to conflict with the Gospels, because the Gospels attribute things to the supernatural. So you're asking for something that doesn't exist. For example, you are trying to say, well, how do you explain Lord of the Rings? How do you explain Lord of the Rings? I think I'm coming into it saying that everything in Lord of the Rings happened. How do you explain it naturally? And well, you think just hobbits are short people? That's ridiculous. I mean, no, that's not what I'm saying. And how do you explain that he turned invisible when he put the ring on? I'm like, well, no, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to explain why Frodo turned invisible when he put the ring on. I'm saying that's a story. So that's people who are critique. I now actually kind of almost ignore people who are critiquing my hypothesis when they're coming at it that literally as a maximalist. So I'm setting that as a stage. So then, in short, people I kind of famously have opened with my 12 pieces of my puzzle that I like to posit. But really, I need to put forth that what I'm saying with my minimal witnesses is that it really only takes two people to have been sincerely mistaken for Christianity, the evidence that we have of Christianity to be accounted for. I'm not
let
saying
me know when you want me to share the screen, by the way. Just
and
whenever. But
so yeah, I'll start with before we get to the 12 stuff. So basically saying it's like, and this isn't the only way Christianity might have happened, but you can account for Christianity with one of his closest followers, and I say Peter's a likely candidate because he's well attested. So let's just call that person Peter. So Peter had some kind of he was sincerely mistaken about Jesus being risen, which needed to kick off a movement, and eventually Paul came around and converted to that religion. Now people ask me why I need that first step. Well, I'm pretty convinced that we'll see how the recent scholarship comes, but at least some of the letters that are attributed to Paul, I think 7. We'll see if that number gets shortened in the few decades. That Paul wrote those himself. Like that there's the easiest explanation is that there was a guy named Paul who wrote those sincerely. And this is where you're saying, well, Paul, you often give me charity for, you're playing in their sandbox. Sure, I am. I'm going to say, that's a reasonable explanation that a guy named Paul sincerely believed the words that he wrote. So fine. But he needed to convert to a religion, right? He's pretty open that he didn't invent the religion. We seem to have evidence that the religion existed before him. So we need some guy to kick it off, and then Paul to popularize it, and then everything else just kind of follows. So that's why I call it minimal witnesses. We just need Peter and we just need Paul. And then the rest of my little details are kind of just filling in the blanks of how I think that we can explain both the minimal witnesses, both the minimal facts that someone like Gary Habermas puts forth, as well as some of the maximal facts that someone like a Jonathan McClatchy or Michael Jones or those kind of people might try and weigh in on. So any thoughts, questions before I start banging into the details?
Yeah, and correct me. I mean, of course, you might be getting into these details because the immediate pushback that I can imagine someone who's skeptical of your skepticism, right? Who's trying to pick apart your skeptical naturalistic worldviews to go, what do you think actually happened with Peter then? And of course they're going to go, well, why did he die? And then that's a whole nother can of worms that you have to go down with explaining the martyrdom stuff, right? Which
and that's actually one of the reasons why we'll get to it, but it is actually one of the reasons why I think Peter's a strong candidate is because I think there is not amazing, but there's actually pretty good evidence that Cephas Peter, I'm also generously just saying that those are the same person. I feel like that's the most parsimonious way to do it. Though even Bart Ehrman has entertained maybe they're not the same person. But if you want to take Cephas and Peter as the same person, there's pretty good evidence that he was the leader of the church around the time Nero started persecuting Christians. So yeah,
let's start your
So do you want the words or do you want the cartoons? What do you want?
Let's vote. What do you say? We get a vote.
The audience, yeah. So one for words and 2 for cartoons.
Yeah, 1 for words, 2 for cartoons. We will not judge you for wanting cartoons. Okay, I promise you. What do you want? It's not like Paul uses cartoons in his videos. He doesn't do that. So 1 is words, 2 is cartoons, 1 is words, 2 is cartoons. Let's get those numbers popping. Let's see where everybody's at. Okay.
We also need to get Derek and I, we are happy to be interrupted at any point with your super chats. So feel free.
Okay.
Yeah, because we you and I we're just chatting today. This isn't like a formal presentation. We're not at Bible literacy, group where I'm presenting a paper. You and I are just chit chatting, shooting the breeze. So feel free to interrupt us with questions but super chats are the best way to do that.
Looking like twos on the rise right now. So Sapien,
all right, cartoons
with cephalopod. Thank you for the super chat. A rowdy cult leader flips a temple, and the government to enforces the peace. The cult has a 2,000-year epic cope. A totally natural explanation. That's a whole nother, like, you and me could hang out and have so many conversations about ideas about how and why Jesus was.
And sometimes the behind the scenes is sometimes we do that, and that's just for you and I having fun. You and I just geek out on some of these details.
Yeah, and sometimes you gotta go. I gotta go because you know me, man. I'll go on and on. I don't hide it. Godless Granny, thank you for being a member and the super chat. Paulogia, have you read Chrissy Hansen's critique on the authenticity of Philemon?
Not yet. So Chrissy has been kind enough to tease me a little bit, send me some of some of her thoughts in advance. You're aware that this exists, Derek, I assume?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So I actually, but I've not read it. I keep other theists keep throwing books at me, so I'm now having to read the new Resurrection book by a psychologist named Nick Meter, who was apparently poking holes in my stuff and put me in the book. But anyway, no, I'm excited to read Chrissy's stuff, though. Very excited.
Thank you, Godless. Okay, we're going cartoons. It looks
all
like
right. Well, so that's my slideshow. If you see that, you can present that. There you go. All right. So this is just visual for me to remember the various things. If anyone actually wanted the words, if you search Bart Ehrman minimal witnesses, you will see there a article that I wrote for the Bart Ehrman blog that kind of lays out my 12 points there. You can follow along with that if you feel like it. And actually, Chrissy helped me edit that piece, so there's a bit of a connection there to the last super chat. So what I have, Derek, is positing the minimal witnesses. I think people who are can imagine things from our perspective, they can kind of get it. They don't need any more words. Hey, sure, yeah, Peter started it, Paul continued it, great, we get it. But some people want to know how this fits into the things, so I'll dive through the 12, poke back at me. People in the chat can poke back at me.
Okay.
But I start with Jesus existed, and that in the early 1st century, among the apocalyptic preachers active in Judea was one Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I think it's pretty undeniable if you read Josephus, for example, that there was a string of apocalyptic preachers slightly before Jesus's time, during Jesus' time, and slightly after his time. That's pretty uncontroversial. I think then it's very natural to say that, hey, there probably was a guy who existed named Jesus. I think that my mythicist friends are going to not like me here at this point. But again, I'm actually just trying to play as much as I can, as you say, in the Christian sandbox. What's the most I can grant? And so I'm trying to maximally grant. So granting his existence for me is just a starter, although I get for some people why it's a non-starter.
Yeah.
I'm not, as we'll go through, you'll see that I'm not saying we know much more other than I suspect if we're going to grant that he existed, granting that he was Jewish is probably also fine.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
And granting that he had some kind of preaching ministry also is an incredibly mundane claim, right? So I'm willing to go with that. I think it explains more than it doesn't. So, all right, number 2, which is, I guess I get to control this here. This Jesus said or did controversial things which led to his crucifixion on a cross, a common practice at the time. So again, secular history tells us that crucifixion, Romans really liked it. They loved to crucify people. They were fans of it. So it's, again, I find a very mundane claim that Jesus of Nazareth, who knows what he said, who knows what he did. He may have stolen food for all we know. He may have flipped tables in temple. He may have said the wrong thing to the wrong person. We don't know. but this guy got himself killed in one way or another. So that's pretty naturalistic thing. And weirdly, I find Christians really want to push back at me at these 2 points, but I'm like, no, I mean, what you say and what I say are pretty compatible. You want to say more. I just want to say less. So that's the first two. For some, that's the controversial part, but you're okay with that?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, is pretty well known. Josephus gives accounts of constant crucifixions, and of course, messianic pretenders, as Josephus calls them, like they're intentionally apocalyptic in the mind, and he is jabbing at them, which is kind of odd. You kind of wonder before he turncoated to the opposite side, was he actually okay with this, or was he? I don't know, but it is a jab at this apocalyptic thing. And then, I don't have any problem with that. I do think he was probably crucified. If you take Paul's letters, when, exactly where, all of those, well, you got to go to the gospel.
Oh yeah. No.
That's a whole nother.
Like, was it anywhere near Passover? Who can say? Was it even in Jerusalem? Like maybe not. Like, again, there's a lot of, I leave all that to those are details I'm not willing to be tied down on. If you had to describe to people what apocalyptic preacher means, like, when you have to explain apocalypticism to people, what do you say?
Well, obviously there's the understanding of internal revelation, right? So there's this idea of receiving revelation, but a lot of it has eschatological implications. So apocalyptic is usually tied with an eschatology. And I like to think of like Jonathan Z. Smith and people like that who talk about a people who are usually subordinate. It's like a psychological way of, we're going to win even though we lose. So there's some psychology, and I always come to the analogy of the poor girls we find out who were abducted by some predator after a decade of reproducing children for him in their basement, escape. And then you have to wonder what their mind went through. They had to somehow make their suffering good. They had to turn the bad thing they're in into something great. Well, when you have kingdom after kingdom after kingdom subduing and conquering your people, and you aren't actually in this place of freedom, there's this idea that like they ended up coming up with a psychological way where the good will receive their reward, and God is going to bring justice and repay the wicked for what they've done. So apocalypticism is like a way of solving the problem of evil in the minds of these people. And it wasn't just a Jewish thing. Zoroastrianism had it, of course, likely influencing Jews, but that's like, in a nutshell, I would say apocalypticism, while an internal revelation, the idea of the end being near is the problem of evil will be solved. And it's supposed to happen in reality, though when it doesn't, cognitive dissonance can find special ways to make the problem of evil internal and spiritual and things like that.
I would agree with all that.
There's probably a lot more that I missed. But
there's not more. I just like everyone's take on it, because that was actually one of the things when I was researching. So I've been working on this as a book I'm very, very slow, and I don't really have much spare time, but that's the thing I've been plodding along on. And then it was kind of like, if you want to say he was an apocalyptic preacher, you kind of got to define what apocalypticism is, right? So, I would agree with everything you said. Largely, though, it's also, as you say, it's kind of making your suffering transcendent. It's like saying, well, I'm part of a bigger cog in good versus evil, and that there will be an end to it. Like, just as you said, it's if you put a big umbrella around it, that's kind of, I think
eschatology in this case, what makes Jesus, really stick out to me is the apocalyptic with the soon and near expectations of like an end is supposed to happen imminent, soon, mellow in Greek, very near. And once you tie those together, of course.
The best argument I have seen for Jesus being apocalyptic is the fact that the church that sprung out of him, the Jesus movement itself, was apocalyptic. So it's weird to think that all his followers, whoever they were and however many knew them even, but that a Jesus movement would have become an apocalyptic movement, which Mark clearly is, right? Without Jesus at least having some of that flavor himself. So that was
right.
Yeah. All right. So that's the simple part as far as Christians are concerned, though atheists like to push back on those first two. So now the third one, and I refined this one a lot, but the resting place of Jesus's body was unknown to his followers, and that's kind of the new simple way I express it. People didn't know where Jesus's body ended up. Now, when people push back on this on me hard, but I try and say, well, how weird is it to think that the thing that most often happened? How am I the weird one saying that this is thing? So what you want to think about is, okay, well, what happened to crucifixion victims? Well, we know that most, virtually every historical record we have is that they were left to hang there naked for days and days and days, because that was actually the Romans considered the display to be part of the punishment. You've subjugated the punishment if you take them down, like you diminished the reason why you do it in the first place. You could just behead them if all you wanted them to do was die.
Yeah.
Put them on a cross for display purposes. So the thing that most likely happened, if you look at the whole empire, was that he'd have hung there for days and days, and eventually, either animals or birds kind of eat the carcass. Crazy enough, the Life of Brian actually got that right. Bart Ehrman pointed out to me once that in the Life of Brian, they actually have crosses in the first opening scenes where very old bodies are still hanging on the crosses. I was like, oh yeah, that's a great point. So that's the most likely thing. But let's say, hey, Derek, well, what about Deuteronomy, where they say, well, you got to take the bodies down in Jerusalem, and where Josephus says that the Jews were so careful that they get the bodies down by sundown, right? Some of those things. Well, how can you say that in Judea specifically that it acted the same way that the rest of the empire does? You don't have any records. Now, they don't have any records either, but no one has any records, specifically talking about that time. So let's just grant for a minute then that, okay, Romans, for whatever reason, and Pilate, who famously didn't cooperate with them in general, let them take the bodies down. Well, what would have happened? Well, the first most likely thing, if there was this exemption, is that the family would have taken the body, right? That there is record in history of families taking crucifixion victims. Not very many, but it happens. Well, if we're going to believe anything about the Bible, we're going to believe that Jesus was not from Jerusalem, right? He was from Galilee, from Nazareth, somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And that his mother was not an influential person in society, right? That this wasn't the kind of thing where Mary had the power to go and ask for victims like some of these other recorded cases are, where it's very powerful people who get their families down. Right. So, okay, Mary, that's the second most likely thing, is the family would have got him. Well, if Mary even did, she wouldn't have had a tomb in Jerusalem to put him in, right? It would have hauled the body back to Galilee and probably ditch-graved him at that point. So, but Christians don't even argue that Mary got the body, so we don't need to spend a lot of time on that one. The third most likely thing then, if no one claimed the body, the Mishnah is very clear that in peacetime, when none of this was happening, that it was up to the Sanhedrin to make sure that no bodies were around at sundown. That was actually the Sanhedrin. Members of the Sanhedrin actually had to forego their ritual cleanliness for this to happen. It was so important that they had to even, go outside the city to make sure that this didn't happen. So the other thing, though, was that there was a criminal's graveyard. In fact, the Mishnah calls for 2 criminal graveyards to be outside of town, and for those to be places of dishonor. Now, Jesus's death was definitely a dishonorable one. If you believe the Bible, the Sanhedrin that very morning voted unanimously that this person had to be killed. So if you are a member of the Sanhedrin and it's up to you to get rid of Jesus's body just because the land can't be defiled by his existence overnight, the criminal's graveyard is where you have to put them. Now, I've talked to Jody Magnus, I've talked to other people, experts in the area. They pretty much agree that criminal's graveyard would have been unmarked. that it would have been, you're not putting a cross up. You are digging a large hole. You're putting them in. You're not remembering who you put where, right? Because these are the people. They're not worthy of having this stuff. So these are the three most common cases. In fact, the only cases we have in history, the only ones outside of the Bible, is that the Romans dealt with the body, that the family dealt with the body, or that the Sanhedrin dealt with the body. Now, in none of those cases does Jesus end up somewhere remembered. In fact, gospel writers seem to almost know this, because they have to invent a character, a magical character, that would explain for people, like, well, wait, how did anyone get Jesus's body? We need a rich benefactor, a very powerful man who has the ear of Pilate, and then that person comes and gets the body. You need Joseph to be a superhero. And if you read Mark and then Matthew and then Luke and then John, he goes from being just a rich man to suddenly, well, how did just the rich man get him? Oh, well, he was also a member of the Sanhedrin. Oh, but didn't the Sanhedrin vote for him? Oh, no. In Luke, now he was secretly a follower of Jesus, even though he voted to kill him that morning. He was a member. He was a rich member of the Sanhedrin who now did this. And each book, you can see the progression of this Joseph of Arimathea character. I should probably do a video on this. Just the legendary development of Joseph of Arimathea is crazy. And then this person disappears from history entirely, to the extent where in the second, third, fourth centuries, they start having to make up legends that Joseph of Arimathea himself was immediately arrested and put in prison right away. And that's why no one could talk to him for the first couple of years, because Joseph of Arimathea was in prison and then escaped to London so that he could deliver the what's the chalice called? The goblet in Indiana Jones. What am I? The Holy Grail.
I don't know the name of it.
The Holy Grail is what I'm thinking of. Sorry. Joseph of Arimathea allegedly had to bring the Holy Grail up to Britain. Anyway, this is legendary development, right? This is a character, a literary device you had to insert, that if you take the Gospels out of it, we have no recorded history does a rich man ever grab a crucifixion victim and throw them in their own tomb. So when they come at me and say, well, you are positing weird things that are low probability, I'm like, no, if the Gospels didn't exist, you would never imagine this scenario that you've got. And they point to other historians, like, is this impossible that Joseph of Arimathea did that? No, it's not impossible. Of course, you could have been a rich, influential person and got the body, sure. But is it the most likely thing? No, it's like the least likely thing. So if you're not assuming that the Gospels are true, if you're not trying to explain how Thomas poked a hole in the side, so I'm not trying to explain how Jesus ended up in this rich guy's tomb, I'm saying that's not very likely. So this is very super controversial, as you can imagine, because it really destroys a lot of the narratives if you kind of just say no one knew where Jesus was put.
There's so much interesting stuff that you go into about the burial, as this is related to Joseph of Arimathea, Joseph's name being, of course, the same name as his father. But this is usually left out of the discussion of the pattern or literary intent. Again, remember, we're back here when we're engaging with apologists. They want to deal with mundane. How do you naturalistically explain everything here, right?
Right.
And we have to back up and go, we're dealing with literary works. And when you start seeing patterns that are there by Mark, and I'm not talking about association fallacy stuff that they can try to slap on me for looking outside and seeing some other deity or something and paralleling another demigod or hero in the Greco-Roman world or whatever. I'm talking two disciples walk up to Jesus and Mark and say, Lord, when we're in the kingdom, please let me and my brother be on your left and on your right. And he's like, you just don't get it, do you? And they're like, no, but Lord. And I think the mother was there or something like, please help my sons, later, this foreshadows thematically in the narrative. I'm emphasizing this for the apologist. Later in that story, you see two men, one on each side. To be in the kingdom, this is how you can end up in the kingdom with Jesus. Take up your cross. There's two thieves, right? One on each side. So once you see the patterns and you start recognizing this is a well-written, crafted narrative, it's a story. You shouldn't just flat out take everything at face value as if this historically happened. And the open grave, that's kind of where I'm at, like, or not an open grave, but an unmarked,
unremembered. Yeah, just
unremembered.
No one knows. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I mean, here's the thing though. What's fun about you, Paul, is you'll play even into those. So you'll be like, okay, I'll happily jump in and go, okay, assuming there was a tomb and he was buried in a tomb, now we have to naturalistically explain the empty tomb or whatever.
Right.
Like, we can do all of that and still walk away going, least likely position is this guy rose from the dead. Like, you don't need, we're just trying to go with history as much as we can and factor in like what would have really happened if this guy really got crucified. That's all we're trying to do.
You reminded me there that Dale Allison was one who actually is the first person that I'm aware of, pointed out a lot of parallels between the Joseph of Arimathea burial story and Moses's burial. And so I actually really need to go into that a little more, because it's like, well, no, the Christians often say, you know, so-and-so was the new Moses or so-and-so was the new David. And they actually kind of agree that the gospel writers, they had their Old Testament, they had their Hebrew Bibles open. And, you know, and if you're looking, well, how was Moses buried? Oh, a rich man put him in a tomb. Like there's definitely parallels there. Before I move on to the next one, should we bang out some super chats before?
Sure. Let's do that. Michael Beverly says, question, Mike Lacona told me his Bayesian posterior on Christianity was 85% true, 15% false. Then he told Deep Drinks he was, what is this, 0%?
0%, yeah.
On Paulogia's hypothesis. How can we explain this discrepancy charitably?
So he was probably, if I want to be charitable to Mike, given that I actually wrote into Mike's show asking a little bit about some of these things, I think Mike thinks that the combination of these 12 things that I'm putting together, the combinations of them multiply out to be basically to be zero. Like if each one is only, you know, 1/1000th of a percent, as Mike would probably put it. He doesn't like what I'm putting forth.
Of course.
I don't know. Do you have a different explanation?
Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking. If he's going to say your hypothesis is 0%, but then grant 15% that Christianity could be false, in just being open and honest about that, then clearly a different hypothesis would factor in a percentage. And what would that hypothesis be? If you asked L.C. Allison Jr., for example, just the question about, I asked him this, if you were a skeptic, Dell, what do you think would have happened to like make sense of this resurrection idea? And he goes, well, when a body goes missing, right, kind of factoring in what Richard Miller's talking about, people become divine. He would have thought, because there was lots of inscriptions, we have the archaeology of them today, making it illegal and telling people, we will put you to death if you rob people's graves and like stealing bodies out of graves and stuff like that. So there were people who were taking bodies of people out of graves for magical reasons. There's a lot of magical papyri and stuff in the time. And we go, what? Like a toe might actually cure diseases and stuff. There's like a lot of weird, magical, kind of superstitious, I guess you'd say kind of like, I don't know, witch doctor kind of stuff in the ancient world. And the humans all over the place were like that. Well, he said that when you had a noble figure, someone who was important, who dies, the body's even more valuable for magical properties. And so in his view, this is a Christian who says, I think that someone would have robbed this body for whatever purposes, potentially in that vein, and they came to a tomb and it's empty. Yep. Now they need to explain, you know, what the heck? Well, he's become a god. The same way you can find that trope in other novels and other things. When the body goes missing, they immediately assume he's a god or in the heaven, right? But I don't know. I'm curious to know, what is that 15% from Mike? That's a good question to ask him. If someone's interested in talking with Mike, say, Mike, you said 15% here. You're not persuaded by his. What is it? Do you give a 15% chance that they lied? I mean, listen to William Lane Craig explain the origins of Mormonism. I chuckle every time he answers it. He goes, well, they were charlatans and they lied. And then he goes, but you can't do that with Christianity. And I'm thinking, thousands of years older material, you can't think they could have potentially were charlatans and made this up for power, for control, for money? Cults. Why do you think Paul's gathering money from these churches to feed the poor? But how do you know? Like today, if I went to a rich church who's taking 10% or they're making lots of money and they say, well, I'm feeding the poor. Do you believe them? Why do you just trust them? Anyway, there's so many questions I have, Paul.
Exactly. I do love that Dale Allison pitch. He does that, makes that same pitch in his book. This new Nick Meter book that I'm reading, it actually uses that for it. It has many chapters on Bayesian proving it through Bayesian stuff. Anyway, then it takes Dale's as like the most likely one. What I laugh though is that Dale's posits then that Christianity grew out of there were zero sincere resurrection beliefs,
right?
Versus where I think there was one sincere one. I feel like I know. I just feel like mine's stronger. I don't feel like the empty tomb, as we just went through. I don't feel like the empty tomb is the stronger thing to explain away versus how did this thing start. So anyway,
interesting. There's so many paths we could go down.
Yeah, for sure.
Sand says, correction, in Mark, Joseph of Arimathea is already part of Sanhedrin. Only later is he wealth highlighted. I
had the order reversed. My bad. But yeah, they it's problematic, and I do need to do a video on that just to get my story straight.
Awesome. Mark Rothenbuller, forgive me if I butchered that. I like this minimal witnesses but take by Paulogia. Frankly, every religion will have a similar non-supernatural explanation of how they came to be. I imagine every modern apologist would agree with that. However, Justin Martyr, the OG apologist, would not. The way he argued this is he's like, look, we believe nothing different than your esteemed sons of Jupiter. And he lists them: virgin birth, Perseus, the idea of death and rebirth, Dionysus, as he was torn into pieces. He gives list after list after list. And then he explains and he says, look, the demons, Satan, if you will, long ago saw the prophecies of Christ coming. And so he supernaturally, if you will, he crafted these kind of deities to imitate and mock the real one, which is later. So his explanation for why Jesus looks and acts in this literature like these other gods and has similarities is the demons knew long ago. Well, I think modern apologists, the ones who want to play the scientific, the IPs and we're smart and we're going to stay with the cutting edge. They could never imagine how they would be viewed if they try to go, well, look, all the demons just made it look like that long before. What's more likely? Yours, which came after, is just imitating the already existing material, or demons long ago? It's really ridiculous to me. So
agree.
Well-reasoned Superhawk, thank you so much for being a member of Paul and reminding us the best path to atheism is to study the Bible. All right. Are we going back to?
Yeah, let's go back to these. So next thing, we can talk about, I think it's reasonable that if Jesus was an itinerant preacher, that he had followers, right? It seems to be known. In fact, Josephus talks about some of these itinerant preachers had thousands of followers. So to posit that there was a group of followers, I don't insist that there were 12. I suspect it was probably much bigger than 12. I suspect that the number 12 was probably, nicely tied to the 12 tribes of Israel and other meanings for this. And even the Bible doesn't claim it was only these 12. So, but he had followers. So that's what let me actually go to my precise wording here. Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but most disappeared into lives, never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard from again, all except for Simon Peter, and possibly John. So I am positing that we don't know what happened to any of the 12, so-called 12, if they existed, other than Peter and John. Now, here's why. People think that I want to take 1 Corinthians 15, the creed there. Well, that lists Peter, so that's why you get that. No, that's not where you get it from at all. I get it entirely from Galatians. So I accept that Paul was a historical figure. Paul says he met Peter. So I can't take Paul at his word and not say that he's lying about Peter. In fact, he met him twice in Galatians 1 and 2. Now,
and they're best friends, by the way.
Yes, we'll get to that. But yes, they're buddies, of course. You can tell in all the literature, as Robin Faith Walsh always points out, they're hugging and kissing in a lot of the iconography. And anyway, in Galatians 2, Paul mentions that someone named John, some pillar of the church named John, was also there. Now, it seems like everyone who wasn't named Jesus was named John. Joshua or John seems to be like most of the names. So I'm just being charitable and saying, okay, let's say the John in Galatians was either John the Elder or John son of Zebedee, like one of them, right? I'm just being charitable with that and saying, okay, sure, okay, they're Peter and John, but and people want to push back to me. Well, Sean McDowell wrote this giant book where it talked about all the martyrs and all this kind of stuff, and we have really good evidence for 4 martyrdoms. And I'm like, well, which 4 martyrdoms do you have really good evidence of? Well, we got Peter. Okay, I'll give you Peter. We got Paul. Well, he's not one of the 12. We got James, the brother of Jesus. He's not one of the 12. And if you include a 4th one, it is James, who was killed in Acts, right? Why am I blanking on? This is part of my problem. Is they all have the same name, and I always forget. The one that was killed in Acts. But the James that was killed in Acts, anyway. But actually, Sean McDowell has recently come out and said, "Well, you know what? Acts alone isn't really a great. I probably shouldn't say that. I probably should, because Acts is part of the Bible, and so just based on Acts alone, probably shouldn't include them. So the big 3 he uses now is, well, James, brother Jesus, Peter, and Paul. Okay, well, those aren't the 12. Why is everyone insisting? Why are there constantly people claiming to me that we have great evidence that the 12 either died or were willing to die, when that's just not what the evidence shows? I actually have recently gone through each of the 12 for my book project, trying to recreate Sean's book. I don't even have good evidence that they were preaching. The only one I have good evidences were preaching were the 2 that I'm showing on screen here, Peter and John. So you can't even tell me this willing to die thing. So if anyone is pushing this at you, come back, ask them what reliable evidence that they have that any of these people were out preaching. I think they disappeared. Probably a lot of them just went home, which is the same, or they joined the next one. They joined up with the Egyptian, or they joined up with someone else, right? They moved on to the next spot with the preacher.
Or yeah, I mean, I like to back up and leave an opening possibly that this is where we get into a literary sense, right? We're reading literature, even in Paul's letters. So if you do back up and go, well, you could even question the list that is in 1 Corinthians 15 and go, were there really 12? Or is this just a rounded off number? Maybe there were. I'm just making a point, like there could be, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, all I'm making the point is, this is the problem I find when they use the martyrdom stuff. Like, there's so many other questions we can't be overly confident on, and we could assume that they were, sure. We've no proof of, right? There's no real strong evidence to prove these things to give you that confidence that they want. They want certainty. And so here's the problem. Say we grant there's 12. Say we grant a couple of them preached. Okay. Why did they die? Because they believed a guy died and rose again, when there's countless tales all throughout the empire, people resurrecting people from the dead, et cetera, et cetera. No, had nothing to do with them believing a guy is risen. In fact, there was nothing illegal or wrong in the Roman Empire to believe such a thing. Well, then why did they die? They died because they believed. That's like, I mean, I'm giving you an analogy, bad one, but nonetheless an analogy. Why did the people flying the planes into the towers, why did they die? If you ask someone in that worldview, in that bubble, they will say, for the noble cause of Allah. They will act like they're martyrs. They will act like they were just, they were good, they were this, they were that. And the opposite, the outside world would probably look and go, what a heinous crime. What an absolute evil deed. Well, one person's evil turns into another person's greatest deed. And here you have Christianity going around the empire, probably breaking laws, publicly doing things or doing things that they weren't welcome to do by the law, getting themselves into trouble, not going, well, recant that you believe this Jewish guy from Galilee rose out of a grave and he's alive forever. Recant that or die today. Like, that's what they want you to think. The reason they died is because they believe he rose again and wouldn't recant. That's legend. That's myth.
Well, here's the, even if you want to take it outside of that, even if you want to just go naturalistically and assume a lot of things, I gave you that list. There was James' brother Jesus, there's Peter, and there's Paul. Those are the ones that even someone like Sean McDowell will say that's the strongest case, right? Well, James, the brother of Jesus, we have two pretty strong records of how he died. They conflict wildly, but in both of them, it was political, right? In Josephus especially, you see that the main high priest was out of town. One guy actually wanted to usurp James's power, and he didn't have approval from his boss, but while his boss was out of town, he killed him. There's no recanting there. That was entirely a political thing. You look at then Peter and Paul. Well, under what circumstances were they killed? If you want to believe that Nero set the fires, right, and then he was scapegoating the Christians, if you accept that secular history is correct, the two known leaders of the Christian church, whom he was knowingly, falsely accusing of this fire, do you think that he called those two in and said, hey, recant and I will let you go? No, he didn't care what they believed because he was lying about them. So even Jonathan McClatchy, lots of other Christians will acknowledge, oh yeah, you know what, if Nero killed Paul and Peter, which most people accept that's what happened, then he did not care one iota what they believed or why. This was entirely a show to appease. So none of the ones that we have affirmed martyrdoms were anywhere close to dying for what they believed.
So couple commenters, there's some really good notes, and this is stuff I was already thinking about. I've had some wonderful talks with Richard C. Miller, who was like putting together, I don't know, an article, might even write a book at some point, of like playing in the sandbox again, right? What if the accusation of Nero was true? I mean, what if that is propaganda against Nero, that he started the fire in Rome when technically he didn't? Think about it this way. We were talking about apocalypticism. Well, not all apocalypticists were gentle pacifists, and not all Christians are that way either. And if they think this world needs to come to an end, maybe they'll spark a match to help it come to an end, especially the Roman world. When you read John's Apocalypse and how you see Rome as this Babylon prostitute that is literally killing the saints and stuff, the propaganda against Rome, why wouldn't a Christian, Nero Kaiser being the 666, why wouldn't one or two Christians have started the fire in Rome? I'm not trying to rewrite history or pretend they did, but if they did, and Nero is rightly accusing them, then guess what? You got yourselves killed, hypothetically, in this scenario. It had nothing to do with recanting. So again, like, there's no way to know, right, what happened. But if you play out the scenarios, in all of them, none of them were like, sword to your throat, just say he didn't rise. Damn it, just say he didn't rise. I'll let you live, dude. Oh, you won't do it. No, dude, it's not happening like that.
And this is all why the sophisticated apologists now have completely backed off the martyrdom claim. They have shifted entirely to willing to die, because they're positing that all 12 are out there, and they could have. the boogeyman was behind every corner, right? And they could have been. They do this, as a dangerous occupational hazard. But I push back. It's like, show me the evidence that Bartholomew did everything. And actually, to your point before, every list of the 12 in the New Testament contradicts the other lists of the 12, right? Including the 2 that Luke wrote. Who even were these people? Oh, well, no, Levi was definitely Matthew. Oh, was he? Okay. All right. And Thaddeus was definitely someone else. Like, okay, you're harmonizing where it doesn't necessarily make sense. Anyway,
but even
that's
in 1 Corinthians 15, just a comment, because I don't know how true this is. There have been some who posit that it's possible, it's not the mainstream position, that it's possible this section in 1 Corinthians 15 is an interpolation. And I'm not saying it is, but let's real quick, just so I understand what they would suggest. The reason it sounds odd and it even makes them think that. All right, here we go. Paul called to be an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of our God. I'm reading NIV. And our brothers. So, hold on. Am I in the right? Sorry. 1 Corinthians 1:15. Sorry. All right. Here we go.
No, so yeah, it starts at verse 2, I think.
Yeah. I'm just going to go with verse 3. From what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was crucified, he was buried on the 3rd day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas. So here we have Cephas and to the 12, right? Okay, that should be it, right? In terms of disciples. Now, it says after that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at the same time, whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, so who are the apostles? Why is James part of a different, there's some people who go, this is odd. It almost seems like it's repeating the list twice, as if you have the 12 and then you have these apostles, like it's repeating, like it's 2 patched in different things. So I'm not saying it is, but there's some people who think this reads odd. Wouldn't you think the 12 were these apostles? Why are there these 500? There's so many different ways in which this might actually be an interpolation. Not so sure it is, but if it is, this would screw up the kind of models we're trying to fit. There's all sorts of interesting ideas around this.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
And apostles and disciples in even in the book of Acts is not synonymous, right? Because Paul and Barnabas and others were apostles. They weren't members of the 12. So you can't conflate a lot of stuff. Anyway, that's probably enough on 12. Basically, just don't believe that they were out preaching. I don't. So distraught after the death of his mentor, Simon Peter became sincerely, albeit mistakenly, convinced that Jesus had appeared to him. Now that's the modest claim I make. I don't need to say how he mistakenly did. There's a whole litany of ways he could potentially have become mistaken that he did. It could have been illusion, it could have been delusion, it could have been hallucination, lots of them. I think there's great support for grief hallucination that lines up very well with Peter. Grief hallucination research, the apologists can't even deny this anymore. Depending on which study you look at, a psychologist on Inspiring Philosophy Channel wanted to tell me, no, 30% is wrong, it's 20. I'm like, okay, fine. 20% of people, but in Japan it's 90, and in other cultures it's 60, right? So it's that these numbers are high, that people have grief hallucinations, that strongly bereaved people have experiences, and sometimes it's a sense of presence, sometimes it's visual, sometimes it's auditory, sometimes it's tactile, sometimes it's even olfactory. And it seems to be like 30% of the people of the 30% even have multimodal. They will see and hear, or they will touch and smell, or some combination. Right. So if you want to say it's as low as 20%, which I was laughing, okay, fine, it's only 20%. Let's say 20% of the disciples had this experience. That's still 2 of them, right? That's still, so I'm saying there was 1. And in the research, and again, these are not people who have mental illness of any other flavor, right? Necessarily. This is in the general population. And then you add on things like when the death is violent, that greatly increases the chance. When you have attachment to the person for your livelihood and for other things, it goes up. Like Peter has all these little check boxes you check, and say, well, man, like he is incredibly highly likely person to have done this. But then people want to throw back to me, well, the psychology literature shows, Paul, 50-year-old psychology literature, that people know the difference. And it's like, okay, North Americans say when they come out of it, they know the difference. But you go to other cultures, and so we have in North America here, we've now developed what we call this monophasic culture, where we think the difference between reality and alternate states of consciousness, that's a very important line. And we teach our kids, those very important lines, stuff. But you go to 90% of the cultures that have existed, they are called what's called polyphasic, where they value things like visions in dreams. They value waking states. They value talking to your ancestors. They value all these other things as equally valid ways, even if not equally valid ways of getting information. And you start looking at, it's pretty much unanimous again that when you consider this anthropology research on polyphasic cultures, first century Second Temple Judaism was definitely polyphasic. Even if you look at the Gospels and the Bible, Peter decides that we can all eat meat now because a curtain came down that had animals in it, right? Like he saw visions. He had what he calls visions in jail of angels that may or may not have been there. He has, and Paul just has list after list of vision after vision, where he's just literally saying, I got this from a vision. And everyone at least in the Jesus movement, is nodding their head. Yeah. Oh yeah. Visions are definitely a way that you can get true knowledge. Peter and Paul were living in a polyphasic culture where they didn't actually, the delineation of was that real or was it not real wasn't important to that culture, right? Like so bringing up super modern studies of people in New York City who can say, okay, well, I had these grief hallucinations, but after I thought about it for a month, I decided it wasn't true. That's not analogous to what Peter and Paul would have gone through. And you are actually being very culturally biased when you do that. And they blame us when we try and read some of these texts and say, well, you're bringing in 20th century, 21st century sensibilities to it. But in this one, they're blind. They're like, no, we have to accept that our delineation of real versus fake isn't real versus fake. So I've been reading a ton of research on this recently. I don't have to insist that any of that is how Peter had it, but there sure is a lot of modern psychological evidence that shows he was a great candidate to potentially think that a vision was really Jesus.
Okay. I want to be quick as much as possible with my little comments here about this, because this is such a fascinating point. One person's all it takes. All it takes, no matter what your path is, one person. Meaning, if they were susceptible to someone of authority claiming to have visions or a spiritual experience, that would be enough in modern churches for the pastor to get up in a poetic way and say, last night I had a dream.
Yeah.
The Lord came to me. He could make it up, or it could be authentic.
Yeah.
Now, here's the point. If one person named Kephas made it up or was authentic, either way is all it takes for it to start. Now, here's why I think that, and we have an actual early second, mid-second century account, and I've talked to you about this. Can I read this briefly to give people a chuckle?
Please do. You pull off my... Yeah.
Okay, so Lucian of Samosata, who's writing in the 2nd century, has this character named Peregrinus Proteus, who believed himself to be a very... what do you call him? He was a... he saw himself as someone significant in the divine way of the world, right? He was a Christian. If you haven't read this, you can read it for free on YouTube. Lucian of Samosata, Passing of Peregrinus. And to give a little context, Lucian is telling you about this guy, and I hope nobody with the pen like Lucian ever leaves a damning report about me on the level he did for this guy. And I wish there was a guy named Lucian in the 1st century writing on behalf of Paul and Jesus. I don't know if this movement would have been successful like it was, because this guy leaves a scathing report. He documents how Peregrinus was once a Christian He was so influential that he was writing Christian literature for the Christians, and he made them look like little children in their sophistication because he was way brighter than them, the way that he talks about Peregrinus. He was writing their literature. They believed him to be the new Socrates, like a new divinity of philosopher in the Christian movement. Eventually, he breaks off from them and becomes a cynic and makes Heracles his major one role model to emulate, to be like. And anyway, he says, you know what? I've reached ascesis. I've reached the highest you can in your philosophical world. He says, you want me to show you? I can prove it. And he decides he's going to become a martyr, so to speak. He's going to purposely die in front of a large crowd at Olympic Games. So Peregrinus sets up a pyre in front of large Olympic Games in the Roman Empire and says, I'm going to show you how true my philosophy is, and I'm going to leap onto this fire, and you're going to watch me pass on to the next realm. Like I'm going to do it right in front of you. Now, Lucian describes all this in great detail and gets into some of the scandalous behavior and lifestyle of Peregrinus. But here's what happens. As I returned, I was thinking busily, my friend, reflecting what a strange thing, love of glory. Here you are. Like, why would someone want to die for their beliefs if it was false? What if it has nothing to do with true or false? What if it has to do with the passion of glory that they have? Yep. Okay. This is 2nd century. This passion alone is unescapable even by those who are considered wholly admirable, let alone that man who in other respects had led a life that was insane and reckless and not undeserving of the fire. Then I encountered people coming out to see the show themselves. So he's walking home, for they expected to find him still alive. You see, on the day before it had been given out that he would greet the rising sun, as in fact they say the Brahmins do, before mounting the pyre. Well, I turned back most of them, saying the deed had been done already. Those whom it was not in itself highly desirable to see the actual spot, anyhow, and gather up some relic of the fire. So some people were so drawn by this Peregrinus figure, they wanted to go grab some of the relics of his body from the flames, from the ashes of the fire. That's how influential this philosopher was. In that business, I assure you, my friend, I had no end of trouble telling the story to all while they asked questions and sought exact information. Whenever I noticed a man of taste, probably someone he thought was educated or liked, I would tell him the facts without embellishment, as I have to you. But for the benefit of the dullards, agog to listen, I would thicken the plot a bit on my own account, saying that when the pyre was kindled and Proteus flung himself bodily in, a great earthquake first took place. Paul, have you ever heard of an earthquake taking place before a tragic death of somebody?
Wow, that I'd have to really rack my brain other than, the one in Matthew. But,
That's a very... you might want to check that again. I'm not so sure there's an earthquake. Is there? I'm just kidding. There, of course, was an earthquake. Accompanied by the bellowing of the ground. And then a vulture flying up out of the midst of the flames went off to heaven, saying in human speech with a loud voice, I am through with the earth. To Olympus I fare. They were wonderstruck and blessed themselves with a shudder. Almost imagine like a Catholic who's like shocked and they do the cross symbol, like, oh my gosh. Okay. It asked me whether the vulture sped eastwards or westwards. I made them whatever reply occurred to me. On my return to the festival, I came upon a gray-haired man. So this is on the next day. I came upon a gray-haired man whose face, I assure you, inspired confidence, in addition to his beard and his general air of consequence, telling all about Proteus and how since his cremation, the burning in the pyre, he had beheld him in the white raiment a little while ago and had just now left him walking about cheerfully in the portico of the Seven Voices, wearing a garland of wild olive. Then on top of it all, he put the vulture, talking about the old guy with the beard that's speaking in confidence, saying he saw him in white raiment at the Seven portico, whatever. Okay. On top of it all, he put the vulture, swearing that he himself had seen it flying up out of the pyre when I myself had just previously let it fly to ridicule fools and dullards. Imagine what is likely to happen in his honor hereafter. How many bees will not settle on the place? What cicades? Is that how you would pronounce that?
Cicadas?
Cicadas? What cicadas will
those
not
are
sing upon
little
it?
scary bugs. Yep.
Okay. What
Yep.
crows will not fly to it, as they did to the tomb of Hesiod, and so forth. As to statues, I know that many will be set up right soon by the Eleans themselves, and also by other Greeks. Anyway, like immediately they're going to deify him. And this guy swears he saw, this is the whole point of it. I'm going to stop
Right.
sharing the screen. He swears that he saw the vulture in the form of Peregrinus Proteus ascend to Mount Olympus with the voice of a human saying, I'm done with the earth. And he goes to heaven. Well, Lucian says, like, I made this shit up yesterday.
Yep.
And this guy swears he saw this the next day. So how can you trust like any of this unless you yourself experienced it?
Right.
I mean, and then you might question your own faculties, but still.
And you think
like,
that but you know, he could have recanted, Derek, you know, and do you think that he could have stopped to this vulture rumor if he wanted to? Like, no, it had taken legs already in one day. He couldn't go around saying, no, I made that up, don't believe it.
right.
No one would trust him.
No one would
Yeah.
trust it. And in fact, the other guy could just double down. No, I saw it. He's
I saw it.
lying.
Yeah,
He didn't say that
exactly.
yesterday. How do you fact check these kinds of things? That's such
Yeah,
ridiculous. And
I always
legend
laugh
can
when
build-
that's the apologetic. Well, fact checking. Oh yeah, right.
Sorry, I hogged up some time.
Oh no,
there.
no, that's I love it. I'm actually now I'm excited that is now on the record, so I can go back and reference that in this video anytime I need it, because I'm going to use it.
I hope so.
So anyway, my next fact, we're on 6. I got to go through these probably a little bit faster. James, the brother of Jesus, became a part of Peter's Jesus movement, perhaps also one of the disciples named John. So it's pretty undeniable that James, the brother of Jesus, was part of the movement. In fact, you know, if you believe Josephus, we're not sure if Josephus really mentioned Jesus or not, but Josephus really did talk about James, the brother of Jesus. Like that's the secular thing we got. Now, of course, a mythicist will say that brother may have meant not biological or whatever, but it doesn't matter. There was a figure, there was at least a figure named James, right, out there leading the church. Now, I don't posit necessarily what convinced them to join the movement, though there's I don't insist that was one thing or another, but you know, you just listed something that was obviously they just could have been convinced, right? Like, so if Peter's there's social contagion, there's all kinds of things that if there's potentially, you know, potentially cognitive dissonance. I don't love to lean on cognitive dissonance, but it's, you know, it's potentially there in the ones that Peter convinced. There's all kinds of ways that you can just convince people, but also I don't necessarily trust that James' brother Jesus wasn't latching on to family business, right? That it's
should
like
not be ruled out, right? If he's a member.
And let's say you take a lot of some of the gospel stuff to have kernels of truth, right? So that let's say at the cross, Jesus looks at Mary and says to the disciple Jesus loved, "Oh, that's your mom now. You look after her." Meanwhile, James is standing like, "Who am I? Am I chopped liver? This is my actual mom, and you're just handing him over to your followers." Like, the family dynamics there alone, if that's correct, it's like, no, to get my mom to actually love me, I guess I need to play along with this idea that he's the savior, right? Like, there's people have done weirder things for family dynamics, but also, hey, do I get this career where I get to actually be important enough that I'm politically assassinated? Like, I don't actually necessarily have to posit that James was sincere.
Right. And no matter what path, again, modern examples, you go to church, there's a reason you were persuaded, you didn't see it, you weren't there, you don't know the empty tomb was real, you don't know that he really rose.
Exactly.
You had an experience from a message from a pastor or from a priest or from a teacher in the Christian movement that persuaded you to join the movement. What we don't even know exactly what caused James to come in. We just don't have that data. And I like your thinking there, but if you factor in family business, you factor in some of this stuff, like any of this stuff is more likely But I've heard a lot of apologists try to make a lot out of James. He was an enemy. He totally didn't agree and didn't believe it. And of course, they have to draw from the Gospels to try and
Yeah,
do something
right.
like this. And once you get into the Gospels, we're dealing with a whole nother world of narrative that is an interesting, fun one. But again, we're approaching the material totally different than the apologists are.
Also, interestingly, you look at some of that stuff starts in Mark, and if indeed that was somehow tied into Peter, was there power struggle? Because we're gonna talk about it in a second here, but it sure doesn't seem like all these church fathers were holding hands, and then so anyway, I'll leave it at that with them. For me, this one's a little bit more important because it's not as intuitive to people. We talked about it before. Stories about Jesus spread from person to person evangelism with the focus on recruiting new followers rather than accurately transmitting historical events. So if you want to say that the Gospels were written only 20 years later, well, they were written in the 50s, which would make all the scholars laugh. But even if you said that, but most people think it's written 70s, even far, far later.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. There's multiple decades of time where nothing was written down. We don't know because this was passed person to person. And for you to posit that if you're trying to convince your neighbor the way you just expressed, no, I'm trying to convince my neighbor that the crucified man is God, and they have questions and you don't know the answer, like, oh, well, but where was he buried? Oh, don't worry, it was a tomb. Like, you can start just filling in details that may be your sincere, honest guess. And then or just a slight exaggeration, because we all want to convince people, right? And I'm guilty of it. You're guilty of it. Every apologist ever has been guilty of, you know what? I said this phrase slightly stronger than maybe the evidence but backs up. Maybe I was slightly hyperbolic, maybe a slightly whatever. All it takes is just, an accumulation of hyperbole to get to, oh no, he was walking on water, right?
Right.
Of course, I'm not trying to say that with this illustration that the walking of water necessarily predated the written Gospels. We don't know which things predated the writing because that's just history can't ever tell us. It's not a thing we can ever know. But we do know that for multiple decades, people were evangelizing, not being historians. They weren't historians. They weren't trying to, copy sacred texts in the way that, the Jewish scribes were doing. And that's admirable and great, but that's not what early Christians were doing. The Jesus movement was about getting numbers and saying whatever you had to say. So that's sort of it.
I agree. I think that we shouldn't posit what's in the Gospels was floating around orally, in my opinion, though we should not be so skeptical that we don't realize Paul has churches in the 50s and 40s that he is in late 40s, 50s, let's just grant. He's communicating what they call eros gamos. He has a sacred lore of the Christ movement in which there's one thing he needs to know and wants to know among them is that Christ crucified and that they are baptized into this deity and they are participating in sacraments such as eating and having communal meals together. And he's trying to teach them how to live. And there's this kind of blend of philosophy that he's teaching and probably story in some way. But the development we find in the Gospels, I tend to see these are intentional literary works that may or may not work off of possible stories that we heard from Jesus. But no way to prove that. I do like what you're saying, though, here. Again, we do know from reading Peregrinus that it took 30 years for the story of the falcon to develop. I'm just kidding. It took one day. And so, if you have decades from the starting point, this is even capturing Christianity is coming to the point of realizing, guys, stop using the freaking Bible. Your video, the last video, he's so done with trying to use this ancient text to do it. Cause I can go and pull up ancient texts that also make claims. He wants to go to modern Marian apparitions and stuff now and exorcisms and modern miracles to bring that instead of the Bible,
Well, it's interesting development for me to think about, the notion of if you're gonna, I'm anti-authority because my faith came crashing down surrounding by just accepting people blindly on authority.
Yep.
But if you are willing to just say, you know what, church tradition, I'm just, that's good enough for me. If you're that kind of person, if that's all you're taking, then you probably should be on the Bible is sketchy, right?
Yep.
Because I'm just going with the Pope, and that's at least you're consistent to your epistemology. It's just people who are inheriting the right to tell me what to say or telling me what to think. Like it's Anyway,
Exactly.
love it. Let's go to the next one.
I'll try not to give too many answers, so we'll have.
Oh no, I love. We're good. We're
Okay.
we're slowing down. So, Paul, a Pharisee who'd been persecuting the new Christians out of a sincere belief that he was serving God, experienced a non-vertical vision of the allegedly resurrected Jesus. I think if you are willing to grant that Paul wrote some of his letters, Paul explicitly says that he saw risen Jesus. We don't know what form it was. He does not elaborate. You shouldn't imagine it was on Damascus Road, even though my illustration kind of almost makes you think that that's what it was. You shouldn't imagine that it was blinding lights. You shouldn't imagine that scales fell from his eyes. All that stuff, Paul does not affirm.
Right.
All we know is that Paul tells us that I did not receive this gospel from any man. I received it from visions. I received it from the Lord in visions. Again, just that's how he got all his information. He didn't. I believe him when he says that he was out persecuting and issuing murderous threats. We don't know if he murdered anyone. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. But again, we're going to take him at his word and probably leave it at that. I think everyone would kind of acknowledge that whatever it was that Paul saw can't have been he couldn't have put the finger in the side, right? Otherwise you're saying that Jesus' second coming happened 3 years after. Like, Christians don't like to say that Jesus in the same form he lived here incarnated again just to say hi to Paul. So no matter what you're thinking, you think it's something different. But let's go to Galatians. Paul met Peter and John, but they didn't see eye to eye. If you read Galatians 1 and 2, where the stories are told, where these gentlemen met, a lot of the Christians want to get excited, and at one point it says that they extended the right hand of fellowship. And well, how could they possibly have extended the right hand of fellowship if they didn't agree on every single thing ever? Like, no, that's not what happened. Paul, before he introduces this story, again reiterates, I did not receive anything from them. They added nothing to my message. These are all quotes in there. It's like, well, no, he's trying to tell us whatever Peter said, whatever these guys did, we were not in sync. He mentions that they shook hands and were on the same page after they had the giant fight where Paul was saying, we do not need anyone to slice their penises to join our movement.
Yep.
And Peter was like, no, everyone's got a penis slice. And Paul's like, no. And they fought about it for a while. And Peter eventually said, okay, all right, fine. You can, if you want a penis slice, you go ahead. And if you don't want to, you don't have to. Okay, fine. That's when they shook hands. They didn't shake hands over, we agree on what the nature of resurrected Jesus was like. It's very clear that Paul didn't care about historical Jesus, or he would have wrote about historical Jesus. The only detail he ever gives about historical Jesus was the ate a last meal, which is, of course, the least to remark. If someone dies, they had a last meal. Like, that's like incredibly mundane. No big deal. So
there's so much there. Yeah, there's so
anyway,
much.
These two did not get along. Any notion that that Habermas or anyone wants to give you that they got on the same page here during this meeting, read the text again. Just read the text again, because these men disliked each other greatly.
And Paul does that over and over in the other letters, like the super apostles. Like, he's like,
these so-called heroes. That's right.
Yeah, and what they've done adds nothing to me. Like, he
Yeah.
He is like boasting about his own apocalypse, again to that term apocalypse, his internal revelation that he's having with Christ. And that's what matters. That's the true final word, is what Paul's getting.
And all the modern scholarship on Acts, of course, is, whether you think that any of it was true or not, all the modern Acts scholarship is that, like, no, someone's clearly whitewashing both of these men to try to make everyone think that they got along. And you only work that hard, thou doth protest too much, because it was well known that they didn't get along, right?
Well,
Like
look at how fictional that is, right? Acts has Paul go to nothing but Jewish synagogues, and then Acts has Peter go to the Gentiles. Like they do the opposite mission of what Paul's letters implies that they're actually doing. So how do you get this whole thing to not only mend them but also fix this rift? Well, Peter gets confirmed through a vision. And Cornelius, and he goes, whoa, God is doing it. Look, everybody, God is doing something radically new. And Paul just pops up to every synagogue under the sun, talking to all the Jews and trying to, like, come on, you know, it's interesting.
Yeah. So I think that because they met, they have to historically exist, but they don't have to agree. All right. This is where you start a lot of your fun stuff. And I learned so much from you. But several decades later, Greek-speaking individuals who had never met Jesus or Peter began documenting the circulating stories about Jesus, the sayings attributed to him, and their interpretations of those narratives. So I am a maximalist when it comes to all the potential inputs that God came into the Gospels. I think they're probably kernels of historical truth. For example, I think he probably was from Nazareth. Otherwise, they wouldn't have worked so hard to explain why someone from Nazareth, like, was born in Bethlehem, for example, right? Like, that's probably a kernel of truth there. But what I'm saying here allows for literary devices. It allows for hagiography, right? It allows for Greek mimesis. It allows for all those things, because I'm acknowledging that this was decades later. They were Greek-speaking people who didn't meet Jesus, who were creating literature. And I don't think anyone who seriously studies the Gospels can deny, and Mike Licona, just his recently whole book is about this. You can't deny that they were attempting to write literature, you know, in some way or another. So, but the important part is they didn't know Jesus. So take it for what it's worth. So we don't need to explain poking in the side, because these are stories. Yeah.
And they're building.
Yeah.
Yep.
Occasionally, some people think I should stop there, really, because, you know, that's the end of it. But I'm actually trying to explain church history. I'm not trying to explain resurrection. So we'll go one step further. Occasionally, some early Christians engaged in disruptive behavior and faced consequences as a result. This is my general response to people who tell me about all the martyrdoms and about all the church persecution, all that kind of stuff. Yes, occasionally Christians were persecuted. That is awful. It shouldn't have happened. Wish it didn't happen. Not right to happen. All those kind of good things. But it is far less prevalent and frequent and all those kind of things, and pervasive, all those kind of things, that then the average person will tell you. Read Candida Moss's book, for example, The Myth of Persecution. Read Bart Ehrman has a book on early church development. Or read a Christian one. Tom Holland, there's other ones where it's this whole idea that Christianity had to be persecuted is not as pervasive as it was. And in particular, I gave the rant earlier, but all the stories about these so-called martyrdoms, they are late developed. They contradict each other. Just for fun, go look up how Bartholomew was killed, or how Matthew was killed, or Thomas was killed, and try and harmonize away that they were killed in different countries and by different methods and at different times. Like, it's just, this didn't happen. And then my last little note, centuries later, in 303 AD, Christianity was temporarily outlawed in Rome, but it gained legal protection 10 years later and soon became the Roman Empire's first official religion, marking its transformation toward the institution we know today.
Mm.
I don't think Constantine created Christianity. I don't think all those things happen. But once you get to 303 AD, you can't deny that pretty much any religion that gets adopted as Roman's official religion everything that happens after that is explained by by just being this state official religion. And so if you look at church history, once you cross that finish line, 303 AD, Christianity was just going to win because that's who won.
So just so we recap your position before we go to super chats, you would suggest there's a Jewish apocalyptic figure who had followers, and one of these followers was named Cephas. I want to let me try to stillman you, and then make a correction along the way. However, interrupt me. All right. So he has followers, and they think the end is coming sometime soon. Resurrection's part of this kind of ideology. Think Jewish ideology, Second Temple Judaism, Dead Sea Scrolls, these kinds of like Jewish literature that you have an idea, apocalypticism. And he gets himself killed somehow, one way or another, whether he was saying he's going to die and come back, or whether or not he died and it abruptly shocks everyone, which people like Bart Ehrman would say. This happens. And in some way, shape, or form, some type of post-bereavement situation happens, likely, in your view, with one dude, and this dude is likely Cephas. This spreads to people like John and anyone and everyone that was a follower of Jesus from there. Was enough to at least cause the contagion of the belief that Jesus was alive, though he was killed and was dead. He's actually alive. One person who made it kind of like we saw in the case with Lucian inventing the story, you tend to give benefit of the doubt and say, I think this guy actually mistaken. Right. So he was mistaken through some type of experience he had through post-bereavement, which you can get into the brain and science and all that kind of stuff. And then everyone else starts to adopt it, and legend builds immediately, grows legs, and starts spreading. And that's why we see so many variations, even in the earliest material in Paul, of different movements that are competing right out the gate. This goes till a guy named Paul comes on the scene, decade or two, whatever. If you take that he actually sometime 3 or 4 years later bumps into someone in the movement, whatever, he ends up having a persecution of the church, whatever that means, whether that means I didn't like them and I talked crap to them, and once in a while we bullied them in a synagogue because I was a Pharisee, and then ends up having his own kind of I feel guilt and shame kind of experience, if you grant that. And he has this conversion, the same way prisoners might, or guards at a prison might actually sympathize with the prisoners that they're guarding somehow there. He ends up buying it, and because he's so charismatic and such an interesting figure, he really pumps this thing out there and starts making noise, but makes a few editorial changes to that earlier Cephas version that just so happens to keep the snip and the you can eat bacon still on the table, but targets a group much larger than Jews, which might have been the only targeted groups initially by the Cephas guy. So now you have Paul. He's spreading this to everybody who doesn't have to cut their ding-dongs, and they can keep eating bacon. And even one more interesting thing is, because I imagine you can hear Jews at synagogues probably express their superior status in the covenant of God. Paul says, you are equal with them. And you, if anything, they don't believe you're better than them because you're in Christ and they're not. So here they get this little like booster mentality that they're actually greater in the true Israel of God, and they're able to cut out the Jewish ideas that are now there. And this takes on legs of its own. And we don't even have to go any further to know that version of Christianity in its various forms went viral.
That's a great steal, man. The only thing I would put just a caveat note there. Neither you nor I want to say that Second Temple Judaism was a single thing.
Of course.
My theory doesn't rely on it being a single thing. We know that it was many things, but some of those things are this apocalyptic version.
Right.
So the existence of non-apocalyptic or non-resurrection believing, that doesn't actually impact my hypothesis at all.
Of course.
To grant that there was a diversity of view. So
the Gospels depict that much with the Sadducees, and I agree. And you could paint that narrative differently if you just said, well, I think someone started the cult. Whether if you go with the data, you think as Kephas, he invented it and made it up, or he had an authentic experience, or if Paul saw an opportunity and decided to jump on because imagine this. All we have is what's written. What if Paul was getting bullied or treated like shit amongst the Pharisees he was participating with and said, man, these asshats over here, I'm joining this club. Honestly, you don't know because there's no way to know it.
No, I do think what is solid, and some people press me on it. I think you and I agree. This basically, Paul joined some kind of existing movement and took it over. There was like it exists. He didn't invent it whole cloth. Something was happening. We can't know what it was, but but he took something over.
Yeah,
hostile takeover or something. Yeah.
I agree.
All right. So we're in Super Chat land?
We are. We're here at Robert Mahaney. Thank you so much, Robert, for the Super Chat. We appreciate the love and the support. Mario Marufo, forgive me if I butcher the last name. Any thoughts on the idea of the crucifixion of Jesus being a metaphor for the crucifixion of the ego? Do you want to answer that?
I think it's unlikely only in that there's so many verses in the Hebrew Bible that talk about the crucifixion is terrible, and I just can't imagine they would make it up that they would make up that their leader was given the worst possible Roman punishment. But that's just me.
Yeah, I don't know, right? What ultimately is the case. I mean, we do have other examples of cults where their central figure, we would use the criterion of embarrassment, and they would look at it and go, what's that? Because Attis castrates himself, right? He cuts his junk off. That's the chief passion narrative of Attis is that he cuts his junk off and bleeds out and dies in front of a tree. And they're proud of that narrative. So and I'm not saying, of course, you can't necessarily move that to Jesus and go, well, they're proud and happy that he got completely slaughtered and annihilated on a cross by the Romans. But I don't know.
I think actually the ego, just as I'm thinking about it, the Greek/Roman philosophy of the ego, I don't think had made it to Judaism widely at that point. I'm not sure that ego, like, so definitely dying to yourself and like the notion of God over self, I think was probably a stronger, if they were making it metaphorical,
right?
I feel like it was just it was a sacrifice culture, right? Paid for the sacrifice, the slaughter pays for sins. If crucifixion was invented, I think it had more to do with that than the philosophy. But this is up for debate, and we could probably have a whole separate show.
For sure. I would like to just end on saying that's the fun part with this literature is that you can interpret it however you want. In case people didn't know, there's like so many versions of Christianity that do just that. And I'm being funny here. But yeah, you can interpret this stuff that way. And you almost wonder if the original authors wanting to have a mystery, so to speak. There's so many, like in Mark especially, there's so many left unanswered kind of questions that makes it a fun read. And I got an interview coming out with Robin Faith Walsh we recorded yesterday. I think it's the best one I've ever done yet with her. Nice. And I think it's going to be a really cool cool video. So
can't wait.
Hope we answer that. Doc Pleuromonot, interesting that James is missing from the crucifixion. Perhaps the just was waiting in the wings as a safety precaution to continue the movement for political reasons rather than safety concerns.
I mean, if you posit that he was a follower pre-crucifixion, any of that's possible. It's also possible he wouldn't have been, if he was involved with the movement pre-crucifixion. You know, if the story goes that they all split, right? Because they didn't also want to be hung on a tree. So the hiding wouldn't have. Yeah, actually, I guess that goes along with what this super chat is suggesting. It's kind of like when they whisk away the vice president. Whenever something happens to the president, they whisk him away to some secret room. Maybe that's what's happening. Sure. All plausible.
Yeah. There's so much interesting stuff. So much. Thank you, Doc. I hope we answered that to the best of our abilities. Melly, thank you for the super chat. Someone with strong faith could acknowledge a naturalistic explanation for the start of Christianity and say, but I still have faith Jesus Christ resurrected. Apologists are weak and think their followers are weak.
So that is, aside from the other opening I gave, I actually probably should include this. All I'm trying to get apologists to admit is that my scenario also answers the facts. You are welcome to prefer your version and think that your version has better explanatory power and whatever else and is more likely. But what I can't stand staring in the faces and pretending that mine doesn't also answer the facts on display, right? Like, go ahead and prefer yours. Cool. But don't pretend that you're the only explanation in town. Yeah.
I agree. And again, I think I'd have... Look, I'm trying to not engage them as much as I once was, because I think I can do so much more with like actually getting into the sources. Like I was telling you,
oh yeah,
there's so much juicy stuff that isn't being done that way that I want to do, and this sometimes can be distracting with apologetics. But I'll put it like this, and I think Paul, you might agree with me. Correct me if I'm wrong. People who believe, who have faith, and aren't trying to claim the historical facts are what we say they are, as if this is it. Look, I have faith. I'm not sure, but I believe, right? That's more respectable than what I hear posited by the Frank Turks and the William Lane Craigs and the Sean McDowells and the everyone, name the list, because what they've done in their apologetics is they said, here's the deal. It is so historically obvious that he rose from the dead, and there is no other exception or even reasonable explanation, that either you're missing all brain cells but two, and so you're a dum-dum, or you hate God. And so these, I mean, like, these are kind of you kind of rule out that actually we're very digging into this inquisitively and actually just drawing a different conclusion because we're not persuaded that this does what you think it does, because we don't think the history is there. No. It's obvious the facts are here. So there has to be another reason why you, Paul, and I don't come to this conclusion. And it's brain cells or sin. I'm just being funny, but you know what I mean?
I agree with you. Amen.
Amen. Mark T. Cyber, forgive me. Thank you for the super chat. No comment was attached to the super chat, and I hope you didn't comment.
Thank you. That's right.
S. Mill, thank you for the super chat. No record of Paul dying young until 160 to 180 CE in Acts of Paul. Not until 170 CE by church father. Could have lived to be 70 and 80 CE and written Mark.
I don't think that's correct, but I
don't either.
Pretty sure that Paul's death is referenced earlier, but I'm not remembering what the earliest. Again, I just a few years ago thought dinosaurs were on the ark. So caveat the whole last 2 hours with, remember, I'm catching up. I think Derek, you also feel like you're playing catch up, right? In our lives, right? We were starting from starting block way back, and we're still catching up. So I'll take you at your word for this, and I'm going to investigate further. Is what I'm going to do.
Yeah, and the idea that Paul wrote Mark, I mean, look, I get the temptation because I do think Mark knows Paul's letters, but I don't like Paul writes his name on his letters according to his letters. So what's the deal with him leaving an anonymous book? You know, there's questions. I'm not going to say could be. I don't know. I have questions, and also some of these scholars who think that Mark knows Paul's letters also say that Mark doesn't always agree with Paul's letters when he's using material from Paul's letters or is aware of it. So these are like things I like to explore. Eric Best, thank you for the super chat. What's your answer to the objection that a hallucination of Jesus, this is in your ballpark, a hallucination of Jesus would be interpreted as a real communication from a dead Jesus, not a living one?
So it largely, we can't know, of course, how someone is going to choose to interpret, right? Like a voice or seeing, especially if it ended up being like, let's say it was some multimodal where Peter was saying, well, I am both seeing him and either feeling the touch or I'm hearing audible voices, which are quite common. I don't know, like for us to psychoanalyze and say, well, they would have had to interpret it as communication from a dead Jesus versus a live Jesus. That's just really speculation, because anyway, I mean, sure, that is absolutely one possible way he could have interpreted, but to insist, I have heard apologists insist that he would have had to have interpreted it. I tend not to be so absolute on how someone has to interpret something. So.
Yeah, I mean, you could find examples where they're criticizing visions and stuff in ancient literature, but the question is if someone did have that kind of experience, how would they, in the Christian movement or people who were followers of Jesus, maybe they would have understood this as like, this is real, and what I just had happen, like you said, post bereavement, this is evidence that he's still around talking and communicating with me.
And we don't know the exact nature of what Jesus was preaching, right? So we don't know, was he actually preaching some kind of resurrection truth? Was he preaching that he was going to be raised? Was the nature of his movement? We don't know what the nature of his movement was. So how that's all going to be interpreted, speculation.
Right. Yeah. So you got 10 minutes. Let's try to blast through these. Wade Rogers, thank you for being a member in Super Chat. If you're watching on Paulogia's live stream, Super Chat through Paulogia as well, ladies and gentlemen. It helps him out. And subscribe to his YouTube channel. I pinned it at the top. John was exiled to Patmos because he wouldn't denounce the faith and participate in the imperial cult. Pliny's letter and Christian stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserve to be punished. Jesus as king was the threat.
Okay.
Yeah. I would just say, so I do think that there would have been competition. I think the Gospel of Mark has the Evangelion. This is the genesis of the Evangelion and of Jesus, the Messiah, the Savior. That would have given off Roman imperial kind of language. Paul uses it. Mark uses Evangelion, and we know there's an inscription in a 9 BCE inscription in a calendar of Augustus being savior of the world, literally using the word his Evangelion. Like, it's the same language. Here's Jesus later casting out legion into swine, and it's so bad the swine have to drown themselves. Like, so if you do take this as subversive language to the empire, it's not Jesus rose. That's not the problem. People rose from the dead. Asclepius raised the dead. Heracles, Isis, all of them are accounted as raising people from the dead. It is maybe you have a different king and you're bending the knee to someone else instead of honoring the king who really rules here, which is Caesar. I don't know. That could be.
I don't think the John who wrote Revelation knew Jesus or was connected.
Right.
So.
Yeah, he has such clear hate though for the imperial cult. That,
True.
Yeah.
True. Yeah.
Thank you, Wade. Mark.
Oh, Fernkoff.
I didn't.
No, he Mark's a regular on my channel asking, is there a new Toast to Toast AM tomorrow, which is a weird show that I do on my channel that is not related to the religion. No, unfortunately there's not. It's Valentine's Day tomorrow. Everyone's got a hot date. So, it's Dave and I are unavailable, sadly.
Thank you, Mark. Mario again is back. How do we know James, Jesus's brother, isn't an interpolation, and Josephus was really talking about James, the brother of Jesus, Ben Damnius? I haven't read this material in a while.
Yeah, so all I'm going to say is, all that's possible. It sure seems like all that's possible. So James, the word, all those words are potentially could be quibbled over. Brother, does that mean biological brother? Who knows? Which Jesus, since we know that Josephus actually references around 10 to 12 different people named Jesus, right? And they aren't the one that we know. All possible. I am largely trying to be the most charitable. Again, I've mentioned this a few times. I'm trying to say yes to as much as possible in my hypothesis. So obviously, if we just straight up say no, like you are, it would be more problematic, but I don't have evidence that it was or wasn't. So that's where I'm at.
Real quick, just to address, but Jesus had rendered unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Exactly. He's not God. And if you read the inscriptions, he's claiming to be a god, and people worshipped him as a god. The Roman imperial cult saw all the Caesars as gods. They had apotheoses like Jesus, post-death ascensions like Jesus. They were seen on Roman roads like Jesus. This is why I think we need to factor in the idea of fictive, inventive, or even purposeful crafting, modeling your cult after famous, well-known, money-making power cults like the Roman imperial one. But here's the point. When they said, should we pay taxes? And Jesus says, what kind of image do you see? You see Caesar, you see Kaiser. And he goes, okay, give back to Kaiser what's Kaiser's and give to God, which is God's. That is a way of saying, look, Kaiser's not God. So it is a bit, of course, again, subversive. And that's why I think that needs to be like at least considered. The Roman... Absolutely. There's a Roman provenance position that tries to make Jesus so pro-Roman and like he's in favor of Rome, like through and through in Mark's gospel. And I'm not so sure that's the case. I'm very cautious on that. Doc Pleuromenon is back. Perhaps Paul might have had Roman connections, a plant as a fell Jewish convert, and was used to weaken the Jewish resistance movement, ignore the law, and respect authorities.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure the Romans were necessarily specifically trying to weaken the Jewish movement. Like they had King Herod installed, who was basically doing for them what they wanted. Maybe. I mean, maybe. I'm not. It doesn't feel like the Romans were specifically on an anti-Jewish crusade per se, other than when they were acting up. Right, like Samosata happened, and there was
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah, I don't know, Paul. I think that I would need some extra data and not just text like Acts and stuff like that are trying to fictitiously paint the Jews as the enemies and constantly trying to get Christians killed and arrested. And every time a Roman soldier is brought in, it's good news. I can see the temptation if someone takes that as literal history, going, notice always the Romans are good and they saved Paul but the Jews are bad. Well, that's the point. They're trying to distance themselves and really scapegoat the Jews as the reason that Christians are becoming witnesses or martyrs, really meaning they're in court often by the Romans, is that Jews are the problem. And so when you hear about us being bad people who aren't doing good, or we're against the Romans, we're not. Look at the Jews. They're the reasons we're in this problem. It's anti-Jewish. And you get this in John. Matthew, I think, hints at it. It might even be in all the Gospels for all we know.
Yeah. And the last thing would be if you take Paul's letters at face value, he was out preaching to the Gentiles. He wasn't actually, he wasn't trying to soften what Jews were thinking. He was spending all his time with non-Jewish people. So
exactly. Thank you, Doc. Deconstruction Zone in the house. Justin, everybody subscribe. Any of the people subscribe. Sanhedrin 11:4 states that some capital executions are done during the pilgrimage festival so that all nations shall hear and fear. Unlikely that he'd get a special burial even by the Jews.
Agree.
Ooh, thank you, Justin. Wade Rogers, thanks for being a member for 26 months. Good stuff, Paulogia. And then he asks, Jesus' followers might have known where the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea was actually located and got confused and thought they'd found it, but it was empty. It might have started a rumor. That
falls in line with, it's along the line of Dale Allison's. Yeah, mistaken tomb for sure.
It's more plausible than in our view. Sand, thank you for the super. How do you think Isaiah 53 plays into it? The account of the burial, disappearance of the body and subsequent sightings fit well into the non-collective servant reading of Isaiah 53. I can't make up my mind.
I feel like the interpretation of Isaiah 53 is the Christian interpretation is entirely post hoc, in my view, and most rabbis who I've spoken to agree. But
yeah, I again, if I'm going to, imagine that there's history over here, whether history or fiction, and you're trying to paint your narrative about your suffering dude, You might look to your scripture for secret messages and stuff, find it talking about a person suffering, whether it's Psalm 22, that's probably talking about David, or Isaiah 53, which is likely talking about Israel. But if you take Isaiah 53 to mean an individual, it might be Jeremiah, because it talks about in his like after the suffering, he's going to have his offspring prolonged and he's going to be blessed with this long life. Jesus dies. He doesn't get a long life. Like there's no offspring and long life here. You see a prophet like Jeremiah who goes through a real kind of suffering according to their stories. So if I find suffering here and I find suffering back here, I might latch onto that text that says something about suffering. That's,
I mean, if you look at the virgin will be a child, right? I mean, the gospel writers are unquestionably scouring the Hebrew Bible for anything that they can borrow and lift and repurpose. I mean, that they're not even pretending they're not doing that. So anytime you say, is that possible? I'm like, yeah, it's possible. Sure is. Yeah. They're writing a sequel.
Do you have time for the last four?
Sure, let's do it.
Bless her. Okay. Dave Lewis, thank you so much for the super. Hey, Derek and Paul, hope you're well. Tangential, what do you think about Q? After listening to Goodacre and Walsh, I'm moving into Q-less territory. Walsh, because Q makes sense with oral tradition.
I haven't heard Mark's lecture yet, although I have it on my to play list. Have you? I don't know if you have listened to his latest lecture on it, but I'm pretty agnostic on Q. It makes sense as a theory to me, but I'm not dogmatic.
Yeah, I'm moving more and more away from the oral tradition, and still you could have had a earlier model of something potentially already circulating sayings among Christians of Jesus or something, just basic stuff. But you don't need to I don't know. And reconstructing it, I don't know. I mean, like all that kind of stuff is just too. It's not my cup of tea anyway. I like the whole mythic stuff. You know me. I'm more into that. Thank you so much. Roger Mills, Paul persecuted the church and also says what he preaches was not learned from men. This says to me, he invented the risen Christ. So he did not learn of Christ while persecuting, or he invented it.
I mean, that is possible. I suppose. I still think that Paul, in some way, shape, or form, co-opted someone else's movement. When he says the passage that Derek read, he says, "What I received, I pass along to you as first importance: that Jesus was crucified, that he was raised." Paul, while in the Galatians passages you're referencing, absolutely does lay claim to most of his message. This is the one section where he says, "I got this from someone else." So, yeah.
Richard Miller actually was talking about, he went back and looked at the Greek, and it seems like we always like to talk about scripture. This is where he gets it from. And yeah, there's places where they get things from scripture, but it sounds to him that these are writings that are spread amongst Christians that he received. So usually this is like mythicists find that and go, everything was invented as an apocalypse, a revelation through Paul. Sorry. So what is this version that Paul ends up coming in and disrupting? What kind of beliefs were that? Did they not have a crucified, resurrected figure? These are questions that you might ask. And I tend to agree that he persecuted them for some reason. And if you did take it that he's Pharisee and they're going, you have your Messiah get killed and crucified, I'm just saying, maybe he's not a fan of that. And you're saying the Messiah got crucified? What? So who knows? The People's Weenus, thank you for the super chat. Do you think Paul was developing his theology before his road to Damascus vision and just used the rumors of Jesus' resurrection to graft onto, or was his conversion a complete shift in his thinking? Love you both.
I think that there's evidence in Paul's writing that he did a 180 of some kind, whether it was entirely his own 180 or was, for example, like he explicitly says he spent his whole life, trying to be the best possible version of a Pharisee should be. And of course, the Pharisee, that doesn't mean he was trying to be the best hypocrite he could be. He was basically trying to be like, I am the best Jewish person who ever did Judaism. He brags about that, but then bragging about, well, now I've given all that up and I have a different thing. So I don't know. I feel like there was a 180 and not a gradual, but Derek, maybe you differ.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't try. Like, these are they kernels? Maybe this guy had a drastic conscious decision and change and ended up, doing something radical and change it. I don't know. Like, did Joseph Smith have a radical, real world, like, wild revelation and change, and it was authentic, or was he a grifter, or was he both? And a lot of people realize the complexity of humans, and a lot of times they're both. So there's no telling me. And
right. It's yes and yes and
it could be right.
Yes,
it's fun to think that way. S. Mill, Paul wrote Evangelion, gave it and letters he saved to Marcion's dad, and he gave them to Marcion. That follows Marcion's report. All fun theories.
Indeed.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I don't know.
All right. Well, I see by my clock on the wall that I'm turning into a pumpkin. So you are free to carry on, but this might be a good place to say goodbye as well.
Paul, everybody go subscribe to Paulogia's YouTube channel. I appreciate you taking the time to come hang out with me, man. I really do.
Highlight of my day.
Did we tell them that they will go to hell for all eternity if they don't subscribe?
We should have probably mentioned. We probably should have led with that.
We should have. The poor people are going to be damned if they don't. You have Apologia Live and you have Apologia YouTube. Go subscribe to Apologia. Look forward to the next cartoon and his live stream. Join his community. Support him. He needs all the support he can get. I really hope they will. So, Paul, thank you, man.
From one tent maker to another, I thank you for all that.
Thank you, brother.
Right.
I will wrap things up because this is a dual stream and there's no point in me going on and on if you're not here. So,
all right. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Later,
Love
everyone.
you, everybody. Have a good one.